Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all of its related high strangeness. I go by Bones, and with us is the notorious Ramex.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So I listened to the previous episode with historian Dr. Bruce Solheim. It was a great episode. I'm sorry I missed it. But what we want to do is kind of continue from there, right?
Yeah, I think we'll keep going with our existing conversation, and Dr. Bruce helped set up the Nazis and the occult, which is something that we've been talking about diving into for a while. So I think we're going to get into that in this episode. But I think it's good for us to recap kind of where we are in the conversation for newer listeners. So we did record the Hacking UFO Understanding and the follow-up episode, which really put out our conclusions, current conclusions about the phenomenon. And we're open to being wrong. We're open to changing our minds, right? As more information comes out. I just want you to know that those weren't philosophical ideas. Those were based on both our UFO research, where science is at from our perspective, and the philosophical stuff. I opened with Plato to talk about these ideas because I thought it was a good analogy to explain to people what science is pointing to, not what philosophy is pointing to. But science is changing all the time. As we've said, things are almost never proven, per se. So we'll see where that goes. But as far as the basis for that, again, I would point out to Donald Hoffman. I would point to spooky action at a distance in quantum physics, right? Sure. Which is what Einstein called it, where there is information that travels faster than light between particles that indicates that they're connected in ways we don't understand. Mm-hmm. So things like that, that's where we got all of that. We'll see. We'll see where all of that goes. But what we do know is that our material sense of reality is limited by our mechanical senses, right? It's limited by our eyes, which can see between 700 and 900 nanometers of light. So you're not seeing anything else beyond that. Our ears can hear a narrow band of frequencies as well. So you're not hearing anything outside of that, right?
Right.
And so it's silly to think that nothing outside of those mechanical devices can affect you physically.
Right. I mean, even as we know, there are certain animals that can detect certain things that we can't. Like, I have a beagle, and beagles actually, from what I've read, they actually can sense odors or smells or whatever beyond what our instruments can detect, which is crazy.
Right.
So I think about that every time I take them for a walk.
Yeah, that beagle's saying the same thing as Jacques Vallée, I think, and John Keel and us, right? And so we're all saying the same thing. We're all pointing to the right direction. If you want to, hopefully, as we dive in further, we can start unpacking it on a piece-by-piece basis, but I think we're headed in the right direction here, so we'll continue. And I feel that Dr. Bruce supported a lot of our conclusions as well in our conversations with him. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, just the fact that, he's got such experience as a historian and as a medium. I mean, he's a tremendous source.
Right. And he helped us kind of introduce the idea of Nazis and the occult, and we kind of talked about it briefly there. But I think we're going to dive into it more from a Fortean perspective and a scholarly perspective, because this is a very interesting and important scholarly debate. It is terrible. Like, everything about the Nazis and everything that we're going to talk about is terrible. And I want to start with that, because I don't want any of this to sound like we're being dismissive of that or sensationalizing it. We actually want to understand it. We take this stuff very seriously. We take what happened very seriously, and we want to understand it better. So in classic Fortean Winds fashion, we begin with a question and not a hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And we go, well, if we wanted to trace this esoteric current with both historical rigor and cultural depth, then we're really asking, is there an occult thread that predates the Nazis, influenced them, and continues into our modern system? And that's central to understanding how esoteric ideology can mutate into political, cultural, and even technological systems or control systems, or systems of transformation, which definitely happened to Germany in World War II. So we're going to try to sketch this out from pre-Nazi esoteric roots that shaped the ideology of some key figures. We would identify those three key figures as Heinrich Himmler, who who was most famous for being the head of the SS, Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's deputy, and Hitler himself, who was into the occult. Those three key figures, I would argue, were most influential on the Nazi Party and in shaping the Nazi Party according to their occult beliefs.
And you can, of course, you got to mix in their just lust for power.
Absolutely. So, and that's where things get very gray, right? You go, well, there's certain tactics that fascists always use. Blaming minorities, focusing the lower class on the minorities in order to get them on your side, moving the oligarchs into positions of power. These are classic fascist tactics, right? So you go, where did the occult get involved? And what point were the conventional fascist tactics what moved Germany, and at what point was it the occult? We won't get to the answer to that question without asking it. And there's a fear in conventional academia that if you ask that question and make it sound too woo, obviously you get away from those very dangerous sort of political movements that can turn people into nasty monsters.
So I think you guys touched on it a little bit in the last episode about where it originated, where the basis of their occult beliefs originated. And it came from the 19th century, right?
Right. There was a famous character that we've mentioned before, but is really worthy of a deep dive in and of herself, and that is Madame Blavatsky. Right?
Yep.
Helena Blavatsky. So she was extremely influential on what we consider to be the occult in the West. And Hermeticism, as we pointed out before, is what we generally equate the occult with in the West. So when we're talking about this, we're kind of talking about it in those terms. There are Eastern traditions, there are traditions in the West which are not popular, which we probably won't get into too much. But the traditions that we're mostly talking about are the Hermetic traditions. And that's what people think of when they think of tarot, the usual. So Madame Blavatsky was incredibly influential on that Hermeticism idea. She claimed to have had contact with some adept masters. She built a lot of credibility in the 19th century. And then she influenced a number of occultists at the time. Certainly influenced some of the big occultists we talked about, like Aleister Crowley. So those three key figures that we discussed, Himmler, Hitler, and Hess, were born into this idea. So even in Austria, these ideas were getting bigger. These ideas spiritualism was big at the time. We've talked about some of those figures. And there wasn't as much differentiation between conventional religion and spiritualism as they would consider it. Like in what we're calling the occult, they would consider spiritualism, communicating with spirits. And it wasn't necessarily as... So not everything at that time would have been considered witchcraft. It would have been considered normal for people. And we talked about how very Christian people like Joseph Smith were doing things like scrying. And so what we would consider occult practices were much more common then. And so these three key figures were born into that. And Blavatsky influences two key figures that would go on to influence the Nazi Party. And those two key figures were Guido von List and Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels. We're going to talk about them quite a bit. I'm trying to keep the names to a minimum.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to have a really hard time with those.
This conversation is going to involve a lot of names. We'll do some write-ups so that you can go look into the individual names. But I did try to pare down the names. So you devout historians out there, please forgive me. But I'm trying to keep this into our typical Fortean Winds drunk history sort of retelling. So von List and Liebenfels, as we're now going to refer to them, are the key translators of Theosophy, which is what Blavatsky created, like this idea of Theosophy that would go on to influence many others. So von List and Liebenfels took Blavatsky's ideas of Theosophy and incorporated some revived Norse paganism, some runes, secret knowledge of Aryan ancestors that they kind of made up or pulled from other fictional sources or other occult sources. Liebenfels founds this magazine in Austria called Ostara, and it claimed Aryans were divine and that other races were degenerate. And this is Hitler's growing up on this magazine. So we know he collected this magazine. I think Liebenfels claimed that Hitler went and visited him and asked for back copies, but that was never proven. But Ostara's ideas certainly show up in Nazi ideology. So it heavily influenced the theology of the time. So now we've traced it from Blavatsky, who said, just to recap, because this is what we're trying to do here. And I don't think that this has been done this way before, by the way. So we're going to recap. So Hermeticism gets revived by Blavatsky and turned towards Theosophy. It influences a lot of people, including Golden Dawn, Crowley in different ways. It influences von List and Liebenfels, and they turn it more towards this Germanic, Aryan, Norse mix that would then become Nazi ideology and theology.
Okay.
An important sort of subset of that is the Volkisch nationalism movement and Romantic mysticism. And these were sort of woven through Ariosophy, and it was a mystical nationalism. That these are concepts that you hear a lot in different fascist movements: blood and soil, sacred German landscapes, like, right? Revival of ancient Germanic and Norse traditions. And this became a sort of folkish movement that really affected Himmler. And Himmler was probably the most occult of these guys. Maybe Hess. They would be in competition. We'll talk about this later. Turned himself in because he thought it was his occult destiny. So these guys were true believers. And as we'll discuss later on, Hitler, not so much, dipped in and out. He more saw it as a means to power. These guys genuinely believed that there was a paranormal supernatural force helping. And the movement, like a lot of folkish movements even today, saw modernity as a sickness, as an illness. And everyone needs to return to the land, return to farming, return to a more natural means of medicine.
Right.
Return to folk medicine. And these things were all coming out in reaction to the Industrial Revolution. We're hearing these same ideas come out in sort of the same ways in reaction to the AI revolution.
Yeah.
So these ideas are still relevant. And we're going to, the paranormal and the non-paranormal ideas that we're going to talk about couldn't be more relevant than today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, culturally, too, you think about it, even in the arts. I remember reading about how even the, early communism, they believed that history has stopped. And everyone in humankind has it all figured out now with the natural sciences booming with Darwinism before that, and then the art has started to get fuzzy, like surrealism and art started to become really popular, and a lot of people in power didn't like that. They thought that it was denigrating. It wasn't good. And so they wanted to stop it. They thought that history stopped now. We know how human history works, and we're just going to replicate it in our own way.
Right. And so they're not, absolutely. And the theology at the time was like, let's get the workers to believe that it is their divine destiny to overthrow the top of Germany and place us in charge.
Right.
And it gets really mixed up because Hitler saw it as a means to an end, but Hess and Himmler were, like I said, true believers. So these occult ideas, because of that, end up getting operationalized within the Nazi Party and Nazi institutions, both to promote Hitler to power and because Himmler and Hess are true believers. So it ends up showing up in a number of different ways. And one of the societies that formed within the Nazi Party that was very occult was the Thule Society. And it was an esoteric society that sponsored the German Workers' Party. So they went directly to the lower classes and said, let's incorporate them with our occult ideas. And that began with a belief in a lost Aryan civilization, sort of like Atlantis, and anti-Semitic esotericism. So the idea is that the Jews began their Hebrew Christian God in order to denigrate you and take your psychic powers away. Like they believed that the Aryan Superman was a psychic Superman, by the way, not a physical Superman. They thought he was physically powerful and perfect, but their superpowers were psychic. That is important.
Yeah.
So, and then there was this prophecy that was all over these guys that was talking about a Teutonic Messiah, right? And they were setting Hitler up to become a Teutonic Messiah. And Hitler played along and he liked the idea, but it was clear that the other people around him thinking he was, a divine wasn't his main intention. He was more grounded. And Himmler, on the other hand, wanted to truly operationalize esoteric and occult knowledge. And he probably got the furthest. Now, as I mentioned, he claimed to have contact with some sort of spirit during his folkish days.
Himmler did?
Yes. So, right. That's very interesting. And we're still digging into that. I really want to find out what that contact was and what he claimed to have happened. It may not have happened, but whether it happened or not, what he claims to have happened, as we've discussed, is very important.
Right.
He goes on to create this castle, Wewelsburg Castle, in Germany. And it came up before because the crypt in that castle is designed very similar to the crypt in Malta that we discussed in some of our subterranean explorations. Okay. So he was definitely trying to tap into some of those same forces, some of those same currents that they were doing all the way back in Malta. And then, of course, he was responsible for pursuing the Grail, pursuing the Ark, pursuing a lot of, he had the SS going all over the world looking for these objects of power. And there was two reasons there. And again, this is how you get both a functional and an esoteric society to work together. They saw Jews and Christianity as a threat. So by them going out and taking their objects of power and owning them, this would be like, now our Aryan esotericism owns your divine gods, right?
Sure.
So there was both a political and a theological motivations behind it.
Right. And of course, just a simple search for justification to conquer and to create the Third Reich.
Right.
Yeah.
So now I want to introduce one more name, which will come up. And this was an astrologer and occultist that ended up influencing the party heavily, Karl Maria Williget. And Himmler was a big follower of his. And Williget believed that he had ancestral memories that were given to him by ancient Aryan gods. So this was, for Himmler, this was his Bruce. He thought, Bruce is in touch with his ancient alien. He thought he had a direct line. Right. And we know that stuff happens. So that's very interesting. And then there's all the symbolism. There's all the swastika itself, which was a theosophical symbol that was changed by Hitler in order to be, it's on the Nazi flag. Every time you see a Nazi flag, you are looking at an occult symbol. There's all the runes, there's the SS symbols. All of the symbolism of the Nazi Party had occult significance, and it was designed as such. And Himmler believed in a cosmic mission for the Aryan race in order to sort of raise humanity up. It was their divine intention. They had very grandiose ideas about all of this. Hess, on the other hand, was super into astrology. And he, as I mentioned, he took a 1941 flight into Scotland that was probably influenced by his esoteric belief and was probably inspired by an astrologer. And after he goes into Scotland and turns himself in and says, "I'm here for my divine intervention," and they just take him in and take him for all of his knowledge of the Nazi Party. Right. And he becomes very important to ending the war. Hitler's so mad, he rounds up all the astrologers at the time, and he says there's no more of this occultism. And he takes that back, and he goes back on it. Occultism, at that point, he realizes has gone way too far beyond his control, and he either has to go with it or look powerless against it.
Right.
So he ends up going with it. But for a minute, he wanted to actually end the occultism thread because Hess turned himself.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then there's Nazi archaeology, which went to Tibet, Iceland, South America, all in search of power. They were very interested and found subterranean structures that were anomalous. The Karakura hole is one that the Nazis found. And then there was a racial ties to occultism. All of this eugenics had occult foundings, and it's difficult to say what came first. Was their decision to pursue eugenics the inspiration for the occult ideas, or were the occult ideas the inspiration for the eugenics? We can definitely find occult ideas that were popular in Germany and Austria that predate any Nazi eugenic experiments. So if you're looking for evidence, the evidence suggests that the occultism predated the eugenics ideas.
Okay, yeah, that would make sense.
It does. So I think that wraps up sort of the very beginnings of those Nazi threads as far as we can take it in a short podcast. Next, we'll talk about where those ideas went during the war, and then we'll follow up with an episode about what happened to those ideas afterwards and are they floating around today.
Good. Nice. Yeah, we're here in the 21st century, and a lot of these ideas, still float around, and you still have movement movements. You can see them online that follow them and believe them. I mean, how does that fit in our historical context? You know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're going to take that on because we can find people that believe in all of these ideas today and online movements that support them. And so they're not dead. And then there's all the ideas that movements that are analogous to it. So, and that's for everyone to decide for themselves. But we can at least go back and unpack what happened then and how it wound its way in today.
Yeah, and and just thinking about earlier you mentioned AI and how that is impacting society today. I mean, that's huge. Because I'll say it again, we live in extraordinary times, man, and historically it's big. And we talk about how the occult came up at the turn of the century, at the end of the 19th century. There was a lot going on scientifically back then and culturally.
Right.
Just throughout the world. So we're living in a time. I'd love to reflect more on how AI is going to impact society.
Yeah, that might be a good fourth episode. Well, the fact that AI is arriving on the heels of the internet, mobile technology, I mean, we're looking at another industrial revolution. And as we've seen through history, both events, ideas, and people seem to be moving in cycles. So I think it's very interesting to look at it.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ram. I guess we'll end it there. Once again, I've learned a lot having these discussions with you. We're going to keep going.
Yeah, I mean, this was great. It was really nice to dive into like some history and something more functional and not be out on the edge where we're trying to solve the entire problems of reality.
Right.
Yeah, this was fun.
Just remember, every time you see a beagle, that beagle is experiencing something you can't comprehend.
Follow the beagle.
All right, man.
Good talking to you, Bones.
Good talking to you. Everyone, thank you for listening once again. And you could always connect with us at ForteanWinds.com. All right, everyone, take care of yourself.